Jacob's Ladder vs. Jacob's Ladder, when Hollywood just can't leave it alone and completely misses much of the ideas that made the original so iconic and creative. I bet if I told you they remade the classic 1990 film, Jacob's Ladder, you would be confused and respond at first with, what? When? Then you might pause and utter the words, but why? The when they made it I can answer for you. The why I really can't give you a good definitive answer on. What I can tell you is that it got released on Dish Network. Yes, the satellite TV service.
Hoppa. Hoppa.
Shut up! The Hoppa! The Hoppa!
Hoppa. Hoppa.
Shut up! Hoppa! Shut up!
One HD DVR for the whole home, free from Dish.
Shut up!
And then it was released to literally a handful of theaters before quickly being forgotten by the one guy who watched the theater, who probably had to leave early because, he only bought the ticket because he had a long wait for the mall haircut place, and then cut out of the movie before it was over because his appointment time came up. What is so interesting about comparing these two films is that the remake dramatically deviates from the original work. The remake isn't a terrible film and had some genuinely well-done moments that really could have lent themselves much better to an original work, had they been daring enough to try an original film idea that they'd let stand on its own. But instead, they dusted off the name Jacob's Ladder and walked away from what made the original so thrilling and overall engrossing. If you watched my movie reviews before, you'll know that when I was younger, my family would raid the local video store. For a time, we were actually the #1 customers because of how much we rented. We could go to the store and basically rent a week's worth of movies because we didn't have cable, and the rabbit ear TV stations would get pretty boring after a while. But at one point, I saw a trailer for Jacob's Ladder on a VHS tape, and I was so enthralled by what I saw, I had to rent it. The trailer was very clearly about a man who was faced with a crisis, and that it was only getting worse as the trailer went on. The trailer was tightly cut, and very selective of the things it would show, and it only showed what made the film more mysterious and interesting. Something that a lot of modern trailers just don't do well anymore. They just kind of give away the entire hook. So, I was quite hooked by that minute-long trailer I watched. So, when I had the chance back at the video store, I snagged it and watched Jacob's Ladder. At probably way too young an age for the film, but, the 90s were great. Jacob's Ladder is an amazing film to me because when I watched it at a young age, the film challenged a lot of the standard conventions you saw in most mainstream films of the late 80s and early 90s.
No, it's not funny. See, according to this, you're already dead.
Which was that the main character always survives, and they will always overcome what challenges them. Jacob's Ladder didn't approach storytelling in that manner, and the film was all the better for it. So from here on out, spoilers. So you've been warned, and we're talking completely ruining the twists of both films. So I'll say it again, you've been warned. But by all means, please share your anger in the comments below. Alright, let's dive into the intros of both films. The original chose to use Vietnam as a narrative backbone throughout the film, as it's used to tie different events together. So the film starts with our lead Jacob, with his unit in Vietnam. The scene is set in a very traditional manner of soldiers giving each other a hard time, when suddenly they're attacked and a few members of Jacob's squad start having some type of strange reactions, and start having seizures. The fight continues for a while, and we see Jacob get bayoneted. This opener is very tense, and it sets up the story as a mystery, because Jacob then awakens from the event. And he's awoken within a subway car in New York with no reference to how much time has passed since Vietnam. The remake, on the other hand, opens with a random man walking down a street. He then cuts down an alley and is strangled to death, but the scene is cut in such a way that it looks like he might not actually have been strangled. It cuts to him just looking like he might have overdosed on something. So right off, the two films are establishing they're nothing alike. After that scene, it jumps to our lead character Jacob in Afghanistan, where it would appear he's an army doctor of some type, and it shows him waiting on a roof with a beer that he's using to cool off his head. Which doesn't seem like something a doctor on shift should need. I mean, don't get me wrong, I enjoy drinking as much as the next person, but I'd rather have a doctor who might be potentially pulling bullets out of me in a war zone, not coming fresh off his own war on a case of silver bullets. But back to the scene. He gets a wounded patient and begins to operate on him when he notices a unique tattoo on the person's arm, which he knows to be that of his brother. So Jacob has a bit of a panic attack at the rationalization, and then the film cuts forward in time. So there's a massive difference established between the remake and the original just in this opening. What was established very early on in the original is that Jacob is the one who we are to experience the story with. The film follows him very closely because it's his perspective and experiences we're supposed to take after and solve the mystery with. The remake, by opening on a random guy who may or may not have been strangled, removes that from the story. It establishes that this world exists outside of Jacob's perspective, which basically goes against the entire point of the original Jacob's Ladder's film. It's a really strange change for the remake to take and still call itself Jacob's Ladder once that original twist is pushed away. The key difference that really makes the remake quite a bit weaker than the original is how they handle a particular moment. The original, after the Vietnam scene, opens with Jacob on a subway car, where he asks folks if he missed his stop, but as soon as the train stops, he passes a homeless person as he gets off the subway car. Jacob pauses and sees something that looks like a tail curl up into the homeless person's coat. That scene is a great setup for the rest of the film because it shows the audience that something isn't quite right with what we're seeing. The remake saves this scene for later in the film, when Jacob passes a homeless man as he gets off the train and stops and stares at the man's feet, which are rather torn up and appear infected. It's not as powerful in terms of what it tells the audience. It doesn't shock us, it doesn't make us question Jacob's reality or worldview. So a lot of the potential power there is lost as to what the story is trying to tell us in that moment. What's quickly established after the opening is that both Jacobs are very different people from each other. The Jacob in the original is established right away as a man who, after Vietnam, left his wife and is with a new woman. It establishes he lost a child in a tragic accident before he went to Vietnam, and that might have been a factor in him leaving his wife and family. But the Jacob in this story has decided that after the war, he no longer wants to think or work really hard, so he decides to work an easy job at the post office. The Jacob in the remake is a doctor who works at the VA and is married and has a son. He's a family man who works as a doctor, so the remake character moves in a completely different direction from the original. The original character was dealing with the traumatic stress of his life by wanting to simplify, and the remake Jacob simply just continues to be a well-put-together guy who has a nice life after the war. The Jacob in the original seems to be okay with his separation from his wife, but appears to be troubled when he sees a photo of the son who died in the tragic accident. It becomes clear by this point the remake is very much its own thing, and it takes a few different moments and ideas from the original, but it begins to share next to nothing with the original. It's actually rather jarring how much the remake goes off on its own. If it bothered to have its own name, it would probably have a chance of being remembered as anything. But because it decides to piggyback on the original Jacob's Ladder, it really gets lost, because of how those stories have next to nothing in common. After just a little bit, the direct comparison angle becomes next to impossible. So I'm going to try my best to summarize both films and give a rough side-by-side, however, in a fashion that doesn't take an hour. Alright, here we go. So the remake goes down a road where Jacob works at the VA, and then one day runs into a Marine that was from Jacob's brother's unit. This event sparks questions from Jacob, who discovers that his brother is alive. Jacob returns home and finds that there are people in his home, and fights with them with a bat, and tries to drag one to a police station, only to find that he's not in his trunk when he gets there. And then he runs into the same guy that was in his brother's unit, who takes him down to the subway, where that guy is killed by some weird shadow grandma. And then Jacob goes into the tunnel system looking for his brother, finds him seemingly hooked on some type of drug. The one thing I enjoyed about the new Jacob's film is they tie in with the old creepy trick the original film used with the head movements, which gave a fun jump scare. But that was about the only thing freaky from this film in terms of horror. So when Jacob gets his brother back home, they recreate the tub scene from the original, which really doesn't make sense here because the person in the water isn't Jacob, it's his brother. The original did the scene really well because it was tense and made him seem really helpless when impacted by an extremely high fever, which, kind of played to the realm that Jacob was in where he really didn't have control of his life. And the whole scene shows that Jacob in the original is starting to be overwhelmed by the context of his reality. The remake, on the other hand, does the scene as if it's checking a box, and doesn't really make much sense the longer the remake goes on because of the twist that will occur at the end of the film. So what's interesting about the remake is that it gets very caught up in the PTSD angle of the story, and follows the ladder medication idea. The original film mentions the ladder in a scene, and it's dramatically more interesting than the remake's take over the course of the whole film. In the remake, the ladder drug is used as a way for vets with PTSD to get over their traumatic experiences, at the cost of their sanity. The original, the ladder is a drug that the military was using to make soldiers more aggressive in destroying the enemy in Vietnam, and the whole deployment in Vietnam is the cause of the story in the original because the drug has a harsh side effect on the soldiers. Alright, so major spoiler warnings ahead. You're getting really close to the main twist here. Jacob in the original is attacked by soldiers from his own unit as a result of the ladder drug. The small bit slipped into their food caused a massive breakdown in his unit. The drug was so effective at making the soldiers want to fight that they started ripping each other apart. And the story from there is Jacob dealing with his own inner demons as he lay dying fighting for his life on the battlefield initially. And then he slowly crawls his way to get help, which is hinted at during the tub ice scene. But then he's actually in a field hospital fighting for his life. The remake takes the latter angle and makes it so the drug treats PTSD. Only it makes you believe you're someone else. You ignore your problems and fall into a fantasy. So the remake goes down a very different angle, where there is no narrative twist about being inside the mind of Jacob. It's just that we observe Jacob's false reality, and that we see him realize he's not who he thinks he is. So the twist in the remake is that he's actually his brother. He's not the doctor. He's the Marine his brother worked on, whose life eventually fell apart because of an ambush that got his men killed. Then in a twist from there, it turns out he's actually working with a person who the audience is shown as a pharmacist earlier in the film. And the pharmacist is actually the one making the latter drug, in some odd attempt to help vets with PTSD, as a way for Jacob to make up for his failure. The ending of the film is Jacob and his brother, who's actually the doctor from the VA, go to confront the guy who's making the latter drug. The pharmacist pulls the gun on them, and in order to save his brother's life, Jacob takes the bullets meant for his brother and then pushes the pharmacist out the window. Jacob dies, and the story ends. So the twist isn't that deep. It's just he thought he was someone else and dies trying to fix a problem he created. So not really as deep or lasting a concept as you have in the original. The simple nature of the ending raises a few doubts about the other events in the film because they didn't even really happen to Jacob. So it's not in his mind, and it happens independently from him. So it's just kind of an odd choice they made there. Like the veteran we saw being strangled at the beginning. Why? That wasn't Jacob's perspective, so it was a really odd choice that really didn't come back around to pay off at all. So that's the major twist in the remake. It's kind of creative and leads to a different overall feeling, but it ends up just being dramatically more shallow than what the original offered. The original gave us a much deeper story that defied conventions concerning narrative and story structure. It presented a story that was at least 3 layers deep. The first being Vietnam, the next being Jacob's post-war life, and the third was some type of terror level that would cross over into the post-war life and would haunt Jacob. The original presented the story in a much less straightforward manner, and it was all the better for it. Jacob in the original is dying on an operating table, and the events of his post-war life are him fighting with every inch of his soul to stay alive. When it cuts back to Vietnam, you can hear him crawling on the ground after being wounded. And then it cuts to his post-war state, where he's trying to figure out what is going on. The original then presents an idea that when you keep fighting, all your problems are demons ripping you apart. But when you accept that it's out of your control, and you're set free, the pain becomes angels that lift you up. Jacob in the original is struggling to find meaning to all the torment going on, and tries to reunite with his unit, and they're all slowly killed, which eventually forces his encounter with the man who made the latter aggression drug. And the scene that follows that encounter gives us an idea as to what was going on with the latter and why it led to Jacob's unit ripping itself apart. The original has points that can seem disjointed, but the more you think about them and how they tie into the different layers of the story, it works quite well. Because Jacob is fighting for his life, and it's all the more interesting as a result. So it becomes clear that Jacob is stuck inside some type of purgatory, after some scenes depict a rather Dante-type levels of torment as he gets drugged deeper into that reality. It's not till the very end that Jacob is shown finding his son, the son who had tragically died in an accident. At that point, Jacob realizes that his life is over and accepts it. He goes up the flight of stairs with his son, and then the film cuts to him being pronounced dead in Vietnam. He fought, but he didn't make it. It's quite a different ending than what you get from most films of the era. And it's all the better for it, because it doesn't try to soften the story to make it more appealing. And that makes the story that much better. These are dramatic oversimplifications of both stories, but these are kind of the key pieces that made their respective stories work with the narrative approaches they took. I left out a lot because I didn't feel they lent to the comparison, and I wanted to avoid too much summarization here. But let me explain something in my closing thoughts. I'll start by saying I don't hate the remake, but I really fail to see the reason for even making it. It didn't set out to do anything better. It didn't really give me much to invest in. It became clear that the Jacob of the remake was an unreliable narrator for the film when he didn't find the guy in his trunk. So it was pretty clear they were aiming at the brother twist. So it wasn't shocking, and it didn't really make me care about the character. The original, on the other hand, presented Jacob as a guy who just wanted to be left alone and not deal with the harder aspects of his life, which had been incredibly rough. He just wanted to find something easy and avoid deeper reflection about his own misery. He knew what was bothering him and just didn't want to deal with it, until his reality started caving in around him. It was much more interesting because it was a reaction of a dying mind, which gave the ending of the film more weight. The remake didn't really have that. It tries to tie his death at the end back to other points in the film, but it doesn't really work or make much sense. Like the scene where he's chasing the Shadow Grandma, and then it cuts to him on a gurney. But that doesn't really happen until the end of the film, so it's a strange choice and doesn't make much sense for the story they provide. So there isn't much here to work with by how they ended the remake. I'll say the remake did have some great shots in it though, but it really doesn't compare to the original in terms of themes or the gritty feeling. So there are a lot of scenes I skipped over, but in short, check out the original if you want to watch a deep psychological thriller that is worth your time. There's so many elements there that make the story worth watching. The remake, you'll probably have a hard time finding unless you have Dish Network, which quite frankly, I'll say you're not really missing much of anything by not watching it. It wasn't terrible, just not really that good. It falls in an odd category of meh, where if you're on a 4-hour flight and your phone dies and you have to rely on the in-flight media, you might be willing to waste an hour and 30 minutes. But yeah, the original Jacob's Ladder has a lot to unpack that I don't think I can do justice here by summarizing some of those great scenes, so just check it out if you have time. But thanks for watching. Hi there! Thanks for hanging out and watching the entirety of this video, where we talk about a remake of Jacob's Ladder that went straight to cable for the most part. But thanks for dropping by. I appreciate the support for the channel. If you feel like bugging me directly, feel free to talk to me on Twitter, @HistoricalNerd. Also, there's www.historicnerd.com you can check out, where some content's posted when I remember to do so. But also there's a Discord. I'll try and link that to the comment section below. But thanks for watching. Hope you have a great day, evening, night, or whatever you're doing. Bye.